Welcome to this month's edition of the Transylvania Lectures series. My name is Ákos Péter, and I am a student at the Matthias Corvinus Collegium University program from Kolozsvár. This event aims to create a platform for the local public where we invite renowned academics from all around the world with whom we can discuss topics relevant and interesting, not just for the Transylvanian society, but also for the larger intellectual sphere. It is my honor to present our dear guests and today's topic. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Please welcome our guests, Shaun Riordan, Director of the Chair for Diplomacy and Cyberspace at the European Institute for International Studies. The former British diplomat served in New York, Taiwan, Beijing and Madrid, as well as the Foreign Office in London. He has spent the last 20 years investigating innovation in diplomacy and how technological change is driving geopolitical risk. His work resulted in 4 books and many articles and book chapters. On the other hand, please welcome today's moderator, Peter W. Szabó, IT professional, founder of Tenger.ai, and of the Hungarian Society of Innovation and Technology in Transylvania. Today's lecture is titled The Geopolitics and Diplomacy of the Metaverse, and we will discuss the economic and technical challenges of building a metaverse and the effect of geopolitical environment on them. Furthermore, from today's topics include the role of diplomacy at dealing with conflicts that emerge when building a metaverse. Let the lecture begin. Mr. Riordan, Mr. Szabó, the floor is yours.
Right, a little bit more about background, why I became interested in the question of the metaverse. As you've heard, I was a diplomat, and I approached the issues of technology and innovation from the viewpoint not of a technologist, I leave that to people like Peter, but from the view of a diplomat, someone who's been a practitioner in diplomacy, not particularly theoretical, but understanding what does it actually mean for how we do diplomacy, and also what diplomacy means for how we look at technology and the interrelationship between the two of them. This grew originally out of my concern that diplomats were really bad at new technologies. I was telling Peter just now, my last ambassador when I was in Madrid used to ask to have his emails printed by his secretary. He would write the answer on the email and his secretary would then type it back into the email and send it. And I spent hours trying to convince him this really was not how we operated entering the 21st century. He then went to become British ambassador in Berlin and did the same thing for the next 5 years. So we're talking about up to 2005 and he's still printing emails, trying to send them. But he was an extreme example. But we've talked a lot about digital diplomacy, and what it really amounted to was diplomats using social media platforms. So the ambassador has a page on Facebook, the first secretary is on LinkedIn, and the third secretary tweets. And it didn't really get much beyond that, and there was no thought about how do we make really innovative use of new technologies, how do we make really innovative use of social media platforms even, how do we measure our effectiveness. And following on from that, I got involved in thinking about, well also, these new technologies, these new digital technologies are creating international agendas. They're creating agendas for things like cyber governance of internet, cyber security, what kind of privacy do we want, how do we manage big internet companies. The big internet companies themselves are becoming geopolitical actors in their own right. And how are these debates being affected by the geopolitics itself? How are these debates being affected by things like the tensions between China and the United States of America, the microchip war that we currently have between these two superpowers? So I'm thinking about all these issues and working on the issues, writing books about them. And then dearly beloved, the sainted Mark Zuckerberg announced he was committing Facebook to the metaverse. And that he was so committing Facebook to the metaverse that now we have to call it Meta, not Facebook. And this led to an interesting discussion among some colleagues of mine. I was invited to take part but couldn't. But they put together an online conference, and you can find it on YouTube, about the diplomacy of the metaverse. And they were getting terribly excited about how would we have embassies in the metaverse. How would diplomats behave in the metaverse? Could we have avatars that made us, as diplomats, look 20 years younger or considerably better looking than 99% of diplomats are? And it struck me they were missing the point. This is not what we should be thinking about. So if we think about Zuckerberg hyping the metaverse and committing himself to the metaverse, my immediate feeling was he was massively underestimating the technical and geopolitical challenges that you would have to overcome to get a metaverse. That this isn't simply a question of being technologically straightforward, and nor is it going to be as straightforward as the internet was. And when I talk about geopolitical challenges, perhaps I want to define quite carefully what I mean by geopolitics. Because geopolitics is one of those words that we all use. It's like globalization. We use it so often, we forget what it means. And because we forget what it means, we're unable to analyze profoundly its implications or understand the extent to which these are human decisions, human analyses. So for me, the geopolitics is not how geography determines politics. It's much more about the political interpretation of geography. And although geography, generally speaking, doesn't change, well, it doesn't change very much, climate change is probably changing quite rapidly for a small island, a volcanic eruption can change geography, but generally speaking, geography doesn't change over human lifespans. Politics does. I will perhaps give an example. If we could compare, on the one hand, Fulda in Germany, on the other hand, Suwałki in northern Poland. When I began as a diplomat in British diplomatic service in 1984, we were still in the Cold War. Fulda was kind of important for us. Fulda was an area of flat land on the border between East and West Germany. That was where the Soviet tanks were going to come thundering through in the event of a Soviet invasion of the West. We were really focused on the Fulda Gap. We'd never heard of Suwałki. Suwałki was a town in northern Poland, and it was inside of Warsaw Pact country. It was on the border with Lithuania. Lithuania is part of the Soviet Union. That's so deep the other side of the frontier, we weren't concerned. Now Fulda is a completely irrelevant village in the middle of Germany. I'm told it's a very pretty village, it's got some nice buildings, but you're not going to go there for the geopolitics of it. And you never will again, as long as Germany is united. Suwałki, on the other hand, has become an all-important corridor potentially linking Kaliningrad with Belarus on the border in the new Cold War with Russia. So we can talk of how the Fulda Gap was immensely important then, and it's not anymore. Suwałki Gap is immensely important now, it wasn't then. Geopolitics changes over time as the politics changes. So given that little qualification, and perhaps start thinking about how the geopolitics is going to affect the metaverse. And something that Zuckerberg won't get in a million years, I promise you. Zuckerberg doesn't get geopolitics. Zuckerberg tried to launch an independent digital trading currency for the world from Facebook, originally called Libra, then he called it Diem. It's now going to kind of fade into non-existence. And one of the reasons was he just didn't understand that was a geopolitical act with massive implications, which would, if successful, change the way we do international trade, and that the Americans were not going to allow it in a million years, nor was the other central banks, nor the Chinese, etc. So he's got a track record. But let's start thinking about the challenges that we've got. Well, first of all, a definition. This definition is taken from a book by Matthew Bell called The Metaverse. He's been writing a lot about the metaverse. Anyway. I'm not an expert in the metaverse. As I said, I think about the geopolitics of it. But I've read his book, read his articles. And I won't read out the definition, you can read the definition to yourself. I think the central points to pick up there, you're talking about massively scaled. So we're not talking at the scale of your individual computer game. We're talking about something that's massively scaled, potentially unlimited users using it simultaneously and rendered in real time in 3D. And with persistence, with history, so that it can really be for you like an alternative world to the physical world. A world that you can go visit, go into, do things, you can trade, you can buy stuff, you can sell stuff, you can play games, and so on. And you can flick back out into the real world. Now, that idea is a very ambitious idea, has serious technical challenges. And serious technical challenge, one of the serious technical challenges is computing power. We simply aren't generating enough computing power at the moment to make it realistic to do it. We can't put it in the devices. We can do it for a game, and you know much more about this than I do, that we can do it for individual games with a limited number of participants. But have, in theory, unlimited number of participants taking part in this is way in the future. So there are some serious technical challenges. Second, perhaps I ought to say something here about why geopolitics of technologies. Because we would normally think that the internet, metaverse, if it ever happens, cyberspace is up there, it's in the cloud. The whole point about cyberspace is it doesn't have geography. And if it doesn't have geography, you can't have geopolitics, because how are you going to have a political interpretation of geography that doesn't exist? I think it's worth pointing out here now that all virtual worlds, all virtual activities are embodied in physical geography. If we think about the internet, think about the internet cables, the transoceanic cables. January, February, we had transoceanic cables in Europe being cut, deliberately being cut. There we see geopolitics impacting on the virtual world. We have the embodiment of these virtual worlds in switching stations, in data storage facilities. And not only that, the supply chain of how we get all this technology. So we need to have rare earth metals, other minerals that are essential to the construction of our virtual worlds. These have to be mined, they have to be processed, there are supply chains. These supply chains are just as dependent on geopolitical factors as our dependence on energy. Which brings us to the other point that's really important. We might talk about all this computing. We may say, well, let's start thinking of what we've done in the past, where our ability to increase computing power has been unprecedented in history. I know we're just going to get faster, we're going to get better. Quantum computing will arrive and it's going to be amazing. But we have to start thinking about the energy that consumes. Cryptocurrencies, mining cryptocurrencies, requires more energy at the moment than the entire global gold industry. In other words, our virtual world is not carbon neutral. It's requiring ever increasing amounts of energy, and this will be an important part of the metaverse. Where are we going to get the energy to drive it? It's not going to be like the internet. Let's bear in mind that the internet was created by Americans. The internet, it's a myth to say that it was created for command and control in nuclear war. It's a nice little urban myth, but it is an urban myth. There was a man called Paul Barron who tried to do that at RAND, and then AT&T said it's too expensive, we're not doing it. So in the end, it was developed by the Pentagon. It was developed by Pentagon academics trying to communicate with each other. But what that means is that all the protocols, all the rules, had already been developed before it went international. And it goes international at a particularly geopolitical moment of American supremacy. So we're in at the end of the Cold War, 1990s, the Americans are dominant, the Russians are a mess, Chinese haven't risen yet, or they're just beginning to rise. And so the Americans are able to impose their concept of the internet on the rest of the world, with all the rules, everything in place. It comes as a unitary fait accompli. Metaverse has been signalled, it's been flagged. Russia may have its own problem to Ukraine, but it certainly recovered a lot from where it was in the 1990s, has to be taken account of. India has to be taken account of. China definitely has to be taken account of. What do they think about the metaverse? Whatever the Chinese think about the metaverse is going to shape what we get. So we're looking at a very different world. And it's not just governments, we have corporates. So, Mark Zuckerberg may think Meta is going to dominate. but it may be Epic Games that's going to dominate. We may see this emerging out of the gaming industry. Maybe other companies got their own views. Google's going to have its own views on what the metaverse. We spoke at lunch, Tencent in China is probably the best placed company in the world to build the metaverse because it's got gaming, it's got AI, it has messaging services, it's got payment methods through WeChat Pay. It's actually got all the things that in Western companies are divided between different companies. So all of those actors are going to have to come together to negotiate the creation of the metaverse. And it's very unlikely that we would get a single metaverse. It's much more likely we get multiple metaverses. We already see the Chinese trying to move towards the Chinese internet. We're seeing the European Union has got its own approach to the internet, highly regulated. We've got the Americans who want a very liberal internet still, or on the other hand, want a very commercialized internet, depending on which Americans you're talking to. So we're beginning to see a kind of progressive fragmentation of the internet itself. Metaverse is likely to be very multiple different kinds of metaverses. And then we've got some practical issues that the kind of things we forget about, but which we have real problems with in the internet. If we're going to have trade, if we're going to have economy in the internet, in metaverse, and most people think that's absolutely essential, that you're doing some kind of trading, whether you're buying permissions, entitlements, buying avatars or whatever, we have to have ways of protecting property rights. We have to have ways of enforcing contracts. And in the real world, we do that through national governments. And we still do it through national governments. Even within the European Union, the contracts are enforced, property rights are guaranteed by national government. What are we going to do in the metaverse? How will we do that in the metaverse? And we're already seeing problems with that in the internet, in terms of internet regulation, property rights, and so on. So I think do we get a single metaverse or multi-metaverses, and do the multi-metaverses compete with each other? Do we have metaverses trying to undermine each other, causing problems for each other? Which brings me to the last slide, and diplomacy in the metaverse. I think we've got three kinds of diplomacy. The first would be the diplomacy of metaverse construction. How do we build the metaverse? How do the different actors agree protocols? How are they going to negotiate between themselves? How are we going to accommodate the views of different governments to these issues? And by the way, I think there may be a problem there for governments in that companies, big internet companies, are going to need diplomats to negotiate this too. And they may well start recruiting diplomats from governments. Governments might not be able to pay enough to retain their diplomats for this. I'm hopeful. I'm still hopeful. Maybe a job there coming for me if I keep myself into these issues. Then I think we're going to have the diplomacy of metaverse competition. How do we manage the relationships between different metaverses? How do we ensure peaceful relations, if you like, between different metaverses? Are different metaverses going to be like countries? And if they become like countries, do we have some kind of Westphalian rules for making sure that they don't interfere in each other's internal affairs? Or are we going to allow them to? Are we going to try and undermine the metaverses of other countries? Use our metaverses to undermine other metaverses? Or even use cybersecurity to undermine other metaverses? These are not technical issues. Technically you can do it. It's a political issue or a geopolitical issue for what are the forces driving you to do it and how are you going to manage those forces and manage those relations. And then diplomacy within the metaverse, within individual metaverses, how we deal with governance issues. Issues like, for example, if people get really committed into the metaverse, really becomes an important part of their life, can we have metaverse terrorism? I discussed this with NATO, did a lecture for NATO on terrorism in the metaverse, and thinking about two possible examples. One is terrorism, well, three examples. One is terrorism to blow up the metaverse. One is terrorism to attack individual avatars or institutions or functions within the metaverse. And another is disinformation through the metaverse. Metaverse is designed for disinformation, particularly using deepfake technologies. And then finally, and I think the least important, is the one that everyone was talking about after Zuckerberg. Are we going to have embassies in the metaverse? I really don't care. Years ago, they created something called Second Life. Most of you have never heard of Second Life, and that's the point of it, really. And the Swedes decided to launch an embassy in Second Life. They built an embassy in Second Life, a virtual embassy. And I was asked what I thought of it at the time. I said, ask me in 5 years' time if it's still open. and it closed down in 18 months because no one ever visited it. Something that diplomats have to remember, and foreign ministers have to remember, and governments have to remember, even in the world of social media, we are the least interesting, most boring, least attractive people in the world, and no one ever comes to our sites. Not least because as diplomats, they know we lie abroad for our country. So obviously we lie in cyberspace as well. So why bother to read what we say? And with that, I'll hand it over to Beda.
Thank you so much. I think this was a fascinating talk so far, and I hope we can continue with some question and answers. The second part of this evening will be first to warm up. I will be asking a few questions, and then you could also do that via an application. I think we should introduce that a bit later, but you probably have used it. Maybe we can do it now as I'm not sure what are the costumes at the Matthias Corvinus, but there is a Menti and a Menti code, and you can use that to send questions. You are probably familiar with it. And let's see, probably until the organizer set that up, and maybe we can have a QR code or just the number somewhere.
Can I point out, as a former diplomat, this has a big disadvantage because you can't see who's asking the question.
Yeah.
In the old days, you could see the person at the back asking a question, you ignore them because you knew you really didn't want to get their question. Now you don't know until you see it on the
the other yeah, that's true, but it also has an advantage, speaking as an IT guy, that you can combine multiple questions into one, which are coming in, and the other which hopefully, and I'm pretty sure it will not happen today, but if the incoming questions are in a low number or dwindling, I can just jump in and ask a few side questions, and then
here we have the gulf between the technician and the diplomat, between the politics and the technology. The gulf we must close this evening.
I'm sure that's somewhat true, so thanks. I take it as a compliment, for one. So just to warm up the audience, maybe let's do it in a non-technological way by raising your hand. So how many of you have heard of Facebook? That's very good. So that was a trick question to make sure that you can raise your hand. Now, how many of you actually use Facebook daily? As in, at least once a day, open your Facebook app or website, depending on which one do you use. So do I. So that's good. Especially good for Mr. Zuckerberg, who's the founder and not just Facebook, but also, as Shaun rightly said, now there is a mother company called the Meta, a publicly traded company in the United States, which has Reality Labs. How many of you have heard about the Reality Labs as a company or platform inside the Meta Incorporated? So yeah, I mean, that's not many, so just a bit of a refresher. The Reality Labs is a business of Meta platforms that produces virtual reality and augmented reality hardware and software, including virtual reality headset, such as the Quest, the Meta Quest 2, the Quest Pro, which was recently launched, and also some online platforms such as the Horizon Worlds. So my question would be, why does Mr. Zuckerberg keep supporting Reality Labs, especially because just in this year it is estimated that it will generate $10 billion loss for Meta, this Reality Labs as a business. So it's a highly, so to say, wasteful, at least based on the numbers, company, because it has a 10 billion a year burn rate, as we say in IT.
I think to understand that we need to go back to the origin of Facebook. And the origin of Facebook is pretty nasty. I mean, Facebook begins in an American university as an app for scoring the attractiveness of female students. I mean, I'm amazed in the age of #WeToo that not more fuss is made about this. It's a pretty tacky, nasty origin. And it was successful. But the reason I want to go back is it ought to tell us something about Mark Zuckerberg. He may not actually be the technical genius we think he is. And he's certainly not the all-round genius he thinks he is. And I think we saw that with Diem. With, as I mentioned, he comes up with the idea he's going to launch an international global trading currency which will undermine the role of the US dollar. And he doesn't understand why the US government goes berserk and the US Congress goes berserk, because what he's proposing, if successful, would mean the US dollar losing part of its reserve currency status, which means you can't run massive deficits, you can't impose secondary sanctions. Geopolitics of it are enormous. The other interesting thing is that actually that accelerated the Chinese introducing their own central bank digital currency. And that was brought forward specifically because they thought that Zuckerberg might do this, which is another reason for the Americans being really annoyed with him for undermining. So I don't think he really understands all of these worlds in the way that he thinks he does. And he's kind of committed himself to the next ambition. We're going to create this wonderful virtual reality. It's going to be my creation of Mark Zuckerberg. And the investment will come good in the future. I think there are lots of problems with that, apart from the problems we've been discussing about the geopolitical challenges and so on. I think the challenges from other companies. And the sense in which I'm not sure Reality Labs has all the technology that he needs. There's more important technology out there being developed, like Epic Games has got much more the gaming-related technology. They're already allowing you to go into virtual worlds with high degrees of realism. And you know more about the different technologies, but he's kind of focused on the headset technologies and putting the computing power you need to have really good experiences into headsets that you can walk around with that don't break your neck from the sheer weight of what you had to put in them. I think it's going to be a major challenge for him. And we're seeing the markets. The market's already saying we don't agree with this, we don't like this. So ultimately, he will be brought down by the markets, saying, get back to selling stuff through social media platforms, because that's what you're good at, mate.
That's certainly true. I mean, that's the leading social media platform with now at least 1/4 of humanity being on it. We are officially over 8 billion people on the globe, and at least 2 billion is registered on Facebook. So still a lot to go, but most of the Western world is on Facebook. But Facebook is quite easy to get into, because nowadays everyone has a smartphone in their pockets, and everyone has access to cheap internet, not just in Romania but all over the globe. A few years ago it was only Romania and Moldova maybe, but fortunately nowadays it's getting widespread. But when it comes to the metaverse, we can't really ignore that most people, including Meta itself and Reality Labs, envision the metaverse as something accessed to a proprietary headset, sort of like a VR glass, some sort of hardware piece. Now, do you think that the metaverse can be as widespread, or those VR glasses can be as widespread as smartphones today?
I think there are two reasons to doubt that. One is actually having the computing power in the metaverse that enables large numbers of people to be online in real time, rendered in real time in the 3D world at the same time, simultaneously. Gaming doesn't do that. Gaming has all sorts of tricks whereby you're not really rendering in real time. You've been able to build loads of stuff in to fix it a bit. So that's going to be a big limitation, that you're trying to get all this number of people. There's that technical challenge, and that's not been overcome yet. One way of getting around the headset problem would, of course, be to have much cheaper headsets being run through smartphones, which is a solution that might be a more realistic one. But even so, I think the expense is the other reason why we can have limited access to the metaverse. Neil Stephenson, in his book Snow Crash, in which he kind of talks about the metaverse and describes a dystopian world where the metaverse, talks about having something like 100,000 people worldwide with access to the metaverse, that it's limited for technical reasons. And so in the best of the worlds where they create, according to what we understand technology at the moment, I think both for the technological reasons and for the money reasons, access will be much more limited than it is to the internet. And that's going to create a new social divide. I point out we still also have a social divide with the internet. And if you want to see that, do courses for diplomats, training diplomats, where you've got them, you do an online course. I do these with the UN. And the diplomats are stationed around the world. And see who's dropping out constantly, because the internet access is not as good in countries where they don't have the same coverage, so they have to turn off their camera, and they apologise for turning off the camera, but that's the only way they can keep a connection going. And so we already have a fairly significant digital divide going between different countries, and between different citizens in countries, and different individuals in countries, and where do you live? And yeah, coverage in Bucharest is brilliant, coverage in Cluj is brilliant. If you go 20 kilometres outside into the mountain, what's it feel like? Or if you're a farmer trying to do your EU farming subsidy online, and it keeps dropping out every 5 minutes. So we've already got problems, and I think a metaverse just make it much, much worse.
That's certainly true, especially if I think about the Quest 2, which is in the United States, it retails for $400. And it's quite an old hardware based on hardware standards. It was released more than 2 years ago. And still in Romania, if you go to EMAG or any other online retailer, you can buy it for 2,600 RON, which is, well, if you compare it to something like the monthly net wage in Romania, the minimum monthly net wage is 1,524 lei, so it's almost double the price of the so-called cheaper Meta headset, because in this October Meta released the Quest Pro, which retails for $1,500. And I don't even convert that to RON, but you can multiply by 5.
And bear in mind, these headsets are nothing like good enough to deliver the metaverse.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where I'm trying to go. So they are quite limited, and also you need, as you mentioned, you need a very good internet connection, which is if you. I think we in Romania are in quite a fortunate situation, because in Romania for 10 quid you can get a gigabit internet. That's one of the best rates in the world, to my knowledge. But if you think about India or the Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, internet is still sort of a luxury. At least reliable broadband gigabit level internet is sometimes even impossible to find, even if you have the money for it. So what do you think of this sort of divide? And it probably has effects not just as you mentioned in your example, not just on the metaverse, but probably even daily life, such as education or shopping or anything.
I think this is one thing that I get really annoyed with Meta about, because the Meta are putting these adverts out at the moment through Facebook, through Twitter as well. This is what the metaverse will do, and it's talking about virtual reality in education. And actually you can do that now. You don't need to wait for a metaverse to create virtual reality classrooms, because you don't need it to be rendered in real time. You just need to have a 3D interactive experience. So we can do all of that now. But by making it look as if you've got to do it in the metaverse, you run the risk of actually pushing it into the future and making it harder, and then really introducing, well, elites can have it, but everyone else doesn't get access to it. I'd like, though, to come back here also to the point I was making about the resources we need, because you're talking about good access, gigabyte type broadband access, but the trouble is it's not actually bandwidth that's a problem with metaverse, it's latency, and we've got a real problem with latency. It's called the speed of light. and you can't beat the speed of light. It gets in the way. And this is one of the problems the gaming industry are having. And also the way that the internet works. Because of the internet breaks up data into small packages, sends them by different routes. How does it decide what route to send it by? Well, it's usually the cheapest route, but that may not be the fastest route. So we've got a design problem in the internet that it's not just about our bandwidth, it's about the latency, the speed with which we're moving the information around. But it all comes back to however much we improve that, however much we improve the computing power, however much we improve the devices, we're still stuck in the raw materials that we need to make them. We've seen this with the chip wars with China, the confrontation between US and China over microchips, which has a fascinating historical precedent. This is not new. During the Cold War, we banned sales of computer equipment to the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union, KGB, set up an office in Leipzig to smuggle in banned computer equipment. Quite general question, does anybody know who headed that office in Leipzig?
Yes.
It's Vladimir Putin. This is how he made his name in the KGB, smuggling in computer equipment from the West. So there's nothing new about these kind of confrontations, but it adds to the problems of constructing these new technologies. Where do we get the lithium from? Most lithium is processed in China. Now, somebody said, not because China's got more lithium, just Chinese don't care about the environmental damage they do processing lithium, processing boron. So we've got building up these supply side dependencies. We're trashing the environment even more, and we're putting ever increasing and ever unsustainable demands for energy. And it's not just metaverse. If you do trade in the metaverse, what are you going to trade with? Cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies demand energy. So we need to understand that this is not just virtual stuff, this is physical stuff as well. And there may be physical limitations on what we can do.
I think you touched two really fascinating points, and I wish all the policymakers, especially in the EU, would be as wise as you are, especially when you mentioned the speed of light. I think EU and especially Eastern Europe has a huge problem today that we are not thinking in data centers. And if you think about Romania or Hungary or Bulgaria or any of the Warsaw Pact countries, you would find that the number of data centers are very limited, and I don't want to go into data center tier theory, but they are all low tier. There is only one tier 3 data center in Romania, and that's also near Bucharest. And there are 3 reliable big-ish data centers in Romania, and that's about it. And when you think about what Shaun said about the speed of light, you would very easily realize that in order to get a real good experience, even before the metaverse, you need to be as close as possible physically to the nearest data center, because all the content will be delivered not directly from the original server, but through content delivery networks. And those content delivery networks rely on an edge node. And if the edge node is close to you, you get really fast internet and you get really good jobs, and not just outsourcing jobs like we get in IT in Romania, because those are plentiful. But those jobs means that you are producing value for a company which is registered probably somewhere in the United States or Western Europe, but not for the local economy. So that's why all the IT industry in Romania is booming, and every city, well, especially Cluj, where we are, but every city is at least trying to steal a bit of Cluj's glory. The majority of the projects in Transylvania, with some notable exceptions such as the UiPath, will be producing value for another country. And because of that, I would really hope that our own politicians and policymakers would think of supporting high bandwidth infrastructure and especially local data centers, because in the western part of Europe, I think Dublin is one of the best examples for that, but also the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, you would find a lot of data centers and a lot of companies who work for the local market. So what do you think, maybe this is a leading question, so I beg your pardon for it, but what do you think would happen if certain countries such as Poland or Romania would decide not to build infrastructure, not to go into that direction, but keep being an outsourcing company, because that certainly provides well-paying jobs. So what do you think that would cause in a global perspective in 10, 20 years?
Well, I think from a global perspective, first of all, you've got the latency problem, the speed of light. So the farther you are away from the data centers, the poorer the quality, and this is going to become much more important as we load more onto the internet. As we want, whether you get to metaverse or not, but if we want to have highly rendered visual stuff on the internet, we've got to get latency down, because otherwise it doesn't work. But there's another, equally important part is security. The longer, the further you are away from data centers, the longer the internet cables that you're depending on, the more vulnerable you come to attack on the internet cables. We in Britain know about this. Not many people know what the first thing the British did in the First World War was. But in August 1914, we sent a fishing boat with a post office engineer off to the west coast of England to cut the German telegraph cable, which he successfully did. And that meant that the poor Germans had to communicate with their diplomats in the Americas on British cables. And we have this idea of the British gentleman. Forget it, we're very ungentlemanly. We were sitting reading their cables. And that's how we were able to read and decipher the Zimmermann telegram, in which the Germans proposed to the Mexicans declaring war on the United States of America, so the Mexicans could get back Arizona and Texas, and that's why the Americans joined the war. But we've seen already this year that the cutting of the transoceanic cables. There is a very important transoceanic internet cable, in fact there are two, that run from Norway to Svalbard. And these carry the information that controls the satellites, the satellite control for GPS and NASA satellites in Svalbard. And one of these cables cut in two places in January, deliberately cut in two places in January. That gives an idea of the kind of vulnerability of, because, as I said at the beginning, the internet is not virtual, it doesn't exist up there, it exists down here in physical construction. You get those vulnerabilities. So there's both an economic argument and there's a security argument that goes with it. Incidentally, there was quite interesting, there was an article written about five years ago about the security of internet cables. And it was written by a young British Member of Parliament that no one had ever heard of. In fact, when I saw the name, I thought it was a female Member of Parliament. He's called Rishi Sunak. He's now the British Prime Minister. Though it might not be next week, the way that we change Prime Minister, so up there against the lettuce again.
Yeah, well, that's really fascinating. Not the speed of changing prime ministers, but
we can blame it on the internet.
That's true. Just to veer a bit back to the metaverse, you also mentioned that you think that the metaverse might be developed by the gaming industry rather than the social media industry. So another raise hands type of question to the audience is, how many of you did play some MMORPGs, like massively multiplayer online role-playing games such as the World of Warcraft or Ultima Online, if you're of that age, or Final Fantasy 14, or whatever you can think of? Oh, so the MMO players sit in the front row. That's great.
I've got chess on my mobile phone. Does that count?
Well, probably not to the usual definition of it. But the thing is, let me continue this question. How many of you play MMORPGs at this day, as in logged into World of Warcraft or whatever your favorite is in the past 2 weeks? I think this illustrates my point that some call the MMORPGs a dying genre. If you think about it, the teenagers of today don't really play them, and most companies are really afraid to create new MMORPGs because they were burned in the past. Huge losses. If you think of really well-founded companies with a lot of resources trying to create an MMORPG, they all failed, like the Age of Conan or Star Trek Online, or there are many examples. Some say even the Elder Scrolls Online was a financial favor to Bethesda Softworks. So it's seemingly over. So do you think that it's possible that maybe it's not related to that? And I'm also kind of going from the angle that recently you probably know the sportswear giant company called Nike. So Nike bought up a company called RTFKT, which is a startup creating digital goods such as virtual clothes for the Metaverse and other Metaverse-related virtually sellable goods. So it was kind of a good match for Nike, but also maybe that's what could drive, or if not what. So what do you think could really drive the Metaverse forward?
Well, before I answer, I'd like to say we saw an illustration of the problem we've got. That the kind of people who are interested in international relations, international studies, geopolitics, even young people, don't play computer games. And they don't play computer games because we tell them to go and read books. So we have this mismatch of the people who are playing the computer games aren't thinking about the world, and the people thinking about the world aren't playing the computer games because we've told them that they've got to go off and read Heidegger, or they've got to go off and read Nietzsche or something. Which they should do anyway, I hasten that. But I'm not enough of an expert in the computer gaming industry to answer that. The kind of thesis that Matthew Ball comes up with is that one way it develops is between the existing computer games on things like the Epic computer games platforms, you start getting increasing interoperability. And the computer games see more advantages in cooperating with interoperability than with competing with each other. So that might be one way in which you start building and from bottom up. But there may be many other ways, and I think when you talk about having things you can sell for online clothing, online things. My favourite story about Nike was with the running shoes that had the app that you uploaded to, and people could track where you were running. And so people suddenly saw all these people doing very strange running patterns in the middle of Africa. And they couldn't know, what is this? And of course it was American Special Forces secret training camps in Africa where they'd put their Nike shoes on and go running in the morning, and they hadn't turned the app off, and so their running routes were appearing. And you know, who needs the FSB or Ministry of State Security when you've got American Marines?
That's a very good point. So, actually, if you mentioned the Marines, now they say that one of the unlikely sources, or maybe it's likely, sources of huge funding for machine learning and artificial intelligence related research is actually the US Army, including not just the Air Force, where you would think that, okay, it makes sense that the Air Force need a lot of machine learning, but also the Marines and pretty much all divisions now are really interested in machine learnings, and my hunch is that the same is true for China, just not as public probably. But what do you think about artificial intelligence in the grand scale of things in not just in cyber diplomacy and cyber security, but as geopolitics go.
Okay, first point I'd like to make about that in relation to the Pentagon and the US military trying to buy in tech. They certainly are, but there's an important change in the way that the world operates. So during the Cold War, we had traditional weapons. The industrial military nexus in America depended on the government. So you had all these big companies, big American defense companies. They needed the government to make money. And so they would do whatever the government told them. In the world of artificial intelligence and new digital technologies, these companies don't need the government. They've already made the money. They're making the money from the private sector. So that dependence on the government has disappeared. And at the same time, many of their employees are very uncomfortable about working with the government. So you remember the Maven project, which was a Pentagon AI, it was trying to bring lots of different AI applications together in US defense policy, and they signed with Google. And Google employees launched an internal campaign to end the project. And so Google had to cancel the project. And I know the Americans are getting really worried about this because they can't depend on the old dependency, and they're not sure they can depend on patriotism. And the Chinese government doesn't have that problem. If the Chinese government tells Tencent they want their IA technology, Tencent will deliver it the next day, or the president of Tencent will go on an internal holiday for 3 months, like Jack Ma did when the Chinese government wanted Jack Ma to break up Alibaba. So I think that's introduced a new imbalance into international relations. There is a new geopolitics of AI in the sense that your AI capacity has now become a way of measuring your status as a superpower. And we saw Vladimir Putin said that the country that is best at AI is going to be the world's superpower. And we've got open competition between the Americans and the Chinese, and we see that. We've talked about the microchip restrictions on microchips, sometimes called chip wars. That's part of this realization of the importance of AI. But I think we also have to understand what AI is. AI is not a weapon. AI is not going to kill you. AI will improve the decision-making of the weapon that will kill you. So AI is essentially an enabler and a decision-making technology. So wherever we see decision-making, analysis of data and decision-making, support for decision-making, you can see AI coming in. But it will be the laser, or it will be the new missile that's been developed that's actually going to do the killing. So that's an important point to remember about it. AI-controlled weapons, the idea that we've got lethal autonomous weapon systems, yes, we've already got them. We're not going to stop them being invented. It's rather like nuclear weapons. Once they've been developed, they've been developed. And the Russians are developing them, the Chinese are developing them, the Americans are developing them, the Israelis have deployed them already, or have deployed one already. And so in terms of geopolitics and diplomacy, the challenge is, are we capable of negotiating rules of the game which restrict where we use AI? Because great danger of AI is if you put have AI-driven weapon systems, they are operating so fast that human controllers are no longer in control. So one of the arguments is, okay, you have an autonomous weapon system, it's taking decisions itself, it's analysing information and taking decisions about who to kill, how to kill them, where to kill them. But you've got a human who's got a finger on the red button to stop it. But the trouble is, a human is soon very far out of date. So either you have the weapon operates as a normal human weapon would do, in which case, why did you build an autonomous weapon in the first place? Or the human gets so far left behind that they can't actually work out where decision making is going on. And this has another problem that AI is not always very good at dealing with, and that's as strategists, as human strategists in war or in conflict or in foreign policy, we're constantly changing our strategies. We're constantly changing our objectives. Because if you're a good strategist, you adopt, these are our objectives, what we want to do, these are the tools we've got, these are the resources available, and then you meet the real world. And I mean, von Moltke said, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Actually, Frank Tyson put it better. Frank Tyson, the boxer, said, everyone's got a plan until I punch them in the mouth. But we're adaptive. We change our strategies all the time. And AI is not necessarily very good at doing that. And we may have decided we want to change the strategy, but the AI has already gone on way beyond us. There's a very good book, I can't remember who it's by, called Army of One, and it's by an ex-Marine officer. And he describes how he's in Afghanistan in the Marine Corps, and there's this kid on the hill. And did they shoot the kid on the hill? They were on a secret mission, the kid's on the hill. Probably a shepherd boy. Almost certainly he will report to the Taliban. And he said, an AI system would kill the kid. Marine Corps should kill the kid, but they decide they're human beings, they don't. And those kind of issues about do we want those decisions being taken by an AI system that just, I mean, it's like the beginning of iRobot, when the robot calculates and saves the policeman, Will Smith. And Will Smith says, no, you should have gone for the skull, because that's what a human does. And the robot says, no, my rules are I must do this. So we've got all of those kind of debates to have, and to what extent, what things are we going to allow the AI to do, and what things are we not going to allow the AI to do. And if we want to do that, then we've got to be talking to Russia, we've got to be talking to China. There's no point in having wonderful we have an international, I don't you know, who knows that we have an international treaty banning nuclear weapons? Yeah? And has it come into effect? Has it come into force? Yeah, it has. 120 countries ratified it. Does it mean anything?
No.
Nah, because no nuclear power signed it. And we don't want treaties like that on AI, on cyber, on the metaverse. So that means we've got to get back to an old-fashioned diplomacy based on interests. And this is what I would talk to do as a young diplomat. Analyse another country, understand how that country sees the world, understand how that country sees its interests, and look for where your interests coincide. And you can build something on that. And don't worry if the country's authoritarian, that's its own people's problem. Don't worry if a country doesn't share your values or doesn't share your ideology. Reaching agreements with people who share your values and share your ideology is easy. Well, easy-ish. Think about the European Union. But it's pretty easy. You don't need diplomats for that. Or it might do with the European Commission. But you don't need diplomats for that. You do need diplomats for reaching agreements with countries that don't share your values, don't share your ideology. And it's not really relevant to our subject, but I think it's a relevant point to make in terms of the kind of diplomacy we need. One of the big failures of Western diplomacy in relation to the Ukraine is that Turkey, India, Saudi Arabia, I can go on, the majority of countries in the world have not imposed any sanctions on Russia. And they're continuing to trade with Russia. And why is that a failure of our diplomacy? Because we've proved completely unable to see the world as they see it and be able to engage with them. We said, we're right, we're morally virtuous. You must be wrong. Well, they're not, because they've got their own view of the world. And we used to have a diplomacy that could do that. So I think if we want to regulate all these areas, we've got to get back to an interest-based diplomacy, a degree of humility that we don't always know right, and the ability to see the eye through, see the world, not just the world, to see ourselves through the eyes of the other, even if we don't like the other that we're dealing with. I've always called it diplomatic empathy as opposed to sympathy. Trouble is that when you talk to a lot of politicians, they will accuse you of going native and supporting the other side. But without that capacity, without going back to that old approach to diplomacy, we're not going to have these global agreements we need. Sorry, that was a bit off topic.
No, that's quite fascinating. I think we do have this Mentimeter, but actually I think we should, because we are talking about maybe touching diplomacy and politics a bit and the metaverse. Who wants to ask questions in person, as in with their own voice? And who wants to ask questions through menti.com, through my voice, which my English is a bit rusty as well, and terrible Hungarian accent. You have all that. So let's have a vote, maybe, if that's allowed. Hopefully it's allowed, and I'm not ruining my reputation with Matthias Corvinus here, but...
I'm not sure as a diplomat I can allow anything related to democracy. It's a terrible mistake.
That's true, but maybe who wants to do it the old-fashioned way, to ask questions? Just raise your hands. Okay, so that's great. It seems that Menti was the great
Did
choice.
you really expect anybody in a conference on the metaverse to admit they were old-fashioned enough that they want to ask in person?
Well, it was worth a try. and then let me just create a new presentation. I'm just calling or maybe there is one actually. So can we use this code from the presentation? Let's see. So is there a way to put the Menti code on the screen from tech? Oh, okay. And which code is that? Because I don't see it. I'm not sure if I'm at the right Menti. No, it's not that. It's not that code. So while I ask a question, can I ask you to just multitask instead of me? Because this is really interesting, and I have some more questions. And then you can.
Do you know the famous Lyndon Johnson comment about multitasking?
I'm afraid not.
He had this phrase he'd use for people who couldn't multitask. He would say, "He can't walk and chew gum."
Wow, that's a great one. And actually, just to continue your line with the AI, which is a bit closer to what I do daily. I'm software developer. I have an AI startup, and there we create some machine learning models. But this is actually not about my work per se, but at the conference there was a machine learning model as part of the talk, and the original purpose of the model was to make sure that a certain drug doesn't have side effects on humans. And researchers created a machine learning model to determine, based on the components, if it is bad for humans or not. So that should be quite a noble goal, right? We don't want people to get side effect from different drugs. Now, all machine learning, by definition, is based on an error function. So the machine learns because it wants to minimize the error function. If one of you is from a technical university and you have machine learning courses, this is among the first things you would learn, that you need to define an error function. And then you define the error function, and then you would learn some really nice maths, such as mean squared error or whatever. But the important thing is you define what is an error. Now, what the researchers did with this very good and very humanitarian, so to say, model, was they flipped the error function around, and in a day it produced thousands of deadly poisons for humans, because the error function was inverse. So instead of trying to minimize the side effect, it tried to maximize the side effect, and then they became lethal. Thank you so much. So we already have some really interesting questions.
Can I just pick up on that?
Yeah, please do, while I'm familiarizing myself.
I think this is one of the problems of using AI and machine learning in international relations, in geopolitics. How do we define the error function? I think machine learning can work very well where it's straightforward to define an error function. But how, when we're looking at international relations, what's our error function? War? Well, perhaps we'd like a war. I mean, we don't always want to avoid wars. So, I mean, defining an error function, I think, becomes very difficult in these issues. And I think the other thing you and I were discussing over lunch is the inability of much machine learning to explain. That there are particularly in international relations, particularly in politics, we want to understand how a decision's been reached. We want to understand how a conclusion is being reached, because we have to explain it to people. And machine learning in general is very bad at doing that. It will give you an outcome, but you don't know how it came to the outcome. I mean, this is the famous thing in the AlphaGo game when it played Seedog at Go, and the then world champion. I think it's in the second game, and I memorized this so I could refer to it, move 37. And the AlphaGo program makes a move 37 that nobody understands. That nobody's got any idea why it did it. And it turns out to lead to a brilliant win. Because it's actually thinking in different ways. It's not thinking like us. And we see this with AlphaZero playing chess. It's the most powerful chess program in the world. No human can play against this. But human chess players are finding it's doing things that no chess player's ever done. And the problem is trying to explain, because it's doing it through having an error function and then playing millions and millions of games against itself, it's coming up with things that chess players wouldn't come up with because it doesn't understand the game in the way the chess players do. And then you've got the explanatory. How do you explain what's going on? Now in chess, that's all right. It means that chess grandmasters are now trying to work out why it does these things and perhaps changing the way we think about playing chess. And you've got time to do that, but you might not have time to do that if you're using machine learning in an international relations context where it suddenly tells you to break off a negotiation and go, okay, or not. And I think actually you want some pretty good explanations as to why. But that also talks to something else. When we're using AI, policymakers have got to understand the limitations of AI. Policymakers have got to understand how AI works, what it can do, what it can't do, and when you should never ever use it. And I don't think they do at the moment. So I think going forward in terms of educating young people who are not actually the AI engineers, but the people who are going to use what the AI engineers are doing, we need to get much better at making sure that policymakers, whether they're diplomats, government officials, army officers, business executives, have the sufficient understanding to know when they can trust it and when not. And I don't know if you know the film Margin Call. There's a wonderful moment in it when Kevin Spacey, as a dealer, is supposed to be looking at what the quants have been doing on the screen. And he looks at the screen of numbers and he turns around and says, I don't understand any of that. Tell me what it means. That's where it gets dangerous.
Exactly, and as you said, it's easy to define the error function for chess because ultimately it should win the game, and
yep.
that's the error function by itself. And even there is a class of machine learning which is just going into game theory and tries to win games, and it's really good. Even in more complex games such as the League of Legends, it can beat high-ranking teams. But going back to diplomacy, the error function is a challenge by itself, so that's for sure. And there is another challenge which was asked and upvoted 6 times. Is interest-based diplomacy even possible in today's society of, quote, social justice warriors?
It is, because the majority of countries in the world do it. The social justice warriors live in Europe and the United States of America. I mean, the worst damage to diplomacy was done by a man called Woodrow Wilson, who introduced the idea of values into diplomacy at the end of the First World War. What we don't remember about Woodrow Wilson is that he was a racist, a white supremacist with very close links to the Ku Klux Klan. He's a thoroughly objectionable human being whose values I don't share in any way whatsoever. But if you go to the majority of countries, I teach in diplomatic academies around the world, and I go into a room of diplomats in Armenia, or in Africa, Ethiopia I've taught in, or in Lebanon, and I go and I talk about interest-based diplomacy. They just go, yeah, sure, that's what we do. But I think it's a particular European problem, and not in all European countries either. French diplomats are pretty national interest based. In my experience of French diplomats, they're not terribly worried about ethics or morality, certainly not in the way they behave in West Africa.
Sure.
So it's a peculiarly limited number of countries, mainly European and the US, who have got into this position of virtue signalling is better than actually doing diplomacy. And I think it's actually very dangerous for Europeans because they're taking an American lead, and the Americans often betray you on this. The Americans will talk about a value-based diplomacy, and then they'll suddenly go and cut a deal with someone. Watch what happens with the Americans and Putin at the moment. Watch what happens with the Americans and Xi Jinping after Biden's meeting with him. For all the talk of morality, of if the American government decides it's in their interest, if Joe Biden decides it's his best interest to get re-elected, to cut a deal, he will do. And I think there's a great danger that Europeans get caught in this trap. And it's a trap the European External Action Service has fallen for completely. They wide out. We don't have a relevant European diplomacy. But if we don't go for an interest-based diplomacy, if we stick with, we only talk to people we agree with, we only have agreements with people who share our values, then we're going to continue to diminish ever more the countries we have the agreements with. And the lesson of Russia-Ukraine should be, if we do stick to this position of values, then we get isolated by the rest of the world. And even countries we think who might share our values to some degree ignore us. So if we think of Turkey, what Turkey is doing with Russia, we think of what Indians are doing with Russia. These are countries that we might think share our values, but they have an interest-based diplomacy. But I think if we don't get into an interest-based diplomacy as Europeans, then I think we're just going to become more and more irrelevant. This doesn't mean that values don't matter. It means that values have to be left to one side when you're doing diplomacy. I remember being taught by a senior British diplomat when I first joined. He said, "Shaun, do you have a conscience? Do you have moral values?" I said, "Yeah, of course I do." He said, "Good. Leave them at home when you come to work in the morning, and you can pick them up on the way out, on the way back home. That's for your private life. A sacrifice you make as a diplomat is to put diplomacy above your personal feelings." But again, I say it doesn't matter. There is a role for NGOs, there's a role for humanitarian activists. There's even a role, God help us, for politicians. But, diplomats leave the values and morals to priests. They're better at it.
And actually, the next question, also coming from the audience, is well, I love this question because it's.
This makes me think I'm not going to love it.
Well, it's because it's quite a question that a young politician would ask. So I'm guessing that this person is at least an aspiring, if not already practicing politician. So it goes like this: climate change, war crisis, energy crisis, world hunger. Those things are literally threatening our society as a whole. Is it ethical to even talk about developing a metaverse? Do we really need this?
I would say no, we don't need it. And I would say that actually it's going to make some of the other problems worse. The idea that we can hide from the real world in the virtual world, as long as we're wealthy enough and technically developed enough, I find obscene. And particularly in the sense that the demands it's going to make for energy, the demands it's going to make for mineral resources are going to make climate change worse, and are going to cause us even greater problems, geopolitical problems. As we start fighting for those resources, we have problems managing the supply chains, and I think we should be thinking about those things before we start launching what in essence is a vanity project. Real world, we've got enough problems in the real world, as pointed out. I would just point out on all these global issues that have been mentioned, and they are global issues, they are issues that threaten humanity and threaten the way that we live. I go back, we're not going to be able to do anything on climate change unless we have an interest-based diplomacy. Because there's no point in cutting emissions in Romania, cutting emissions in Hungary, cutting emissions in the rest of the European Union if China's not cutting emissions. So for me, things like climate change, in that sense, we talk about emissions cutting, is not a domestic policy issue. It's not a policy for the Ministry of the Environment or the Ministry of Energy. It's a policy for the Foreign Ministry. Because it's the Foreign Ministry that's got to find ways of persuading other countries to do it. And that's got to be based on interests and identifying common interests. I remember John Kerry made a comment about this in relation to China. He said, no, we're not going to get the Chinese to sign up on climate change if we spend our entire time insulting them and punishing them and stopping them buying microchips and insulting them, accusing them of genocide in Xinjiang. What's more important, that they sign up to carbon emissions or that we feel good for criticising their values?
That's true, and also, unfortunately, lot of the pollution which is happening globally is not local to the United States or Western Europe. That's for sure. So,
but it's still our pollution.
Yeah, it's
we
still
exported
a global.
it.
Yeah,
we in Europe we have not cut carbon emissions at all. We simply exported carbon emissions to China, to India, to Africa, to other countries that do our polluting on our behalf. Even when we look at our renewable energies and we say about we've got very low carbon emissions on renewable energies, that's because we don't look at the supply chain. If we look down the supply chain, we'd find that our renewable energies are also causing increases in carbon emissions. And as for electric cars, I won't even go there in terms of their non-sustainability. Sorry, perhaps we should get back and live in the metaverse instead.
Which leads to the next question, and it's kind of tied to the previous one. That's why I picked this one. How likely that political activists' voice would be louder in the metaverse than out in our universe, in the physical reality, I assume?
I think two things here. First of all, there is no doubt that the internet has facilitated internet activism. That before the internet, to have any kind of political influence, to have any kind of activism, you had to have a critical mass of people in a limited geographical area. If you didn't have that, you weren't going to impact on anyone. The internet means that you can connect a small group of activists here with a small group there, and you can have a much greater impact at a global level. So, and the ability to gain information, to gather information, so on. So the internet undoubtedly has helped activism. It's also damaged activism because it's facilitated disinformation. And the internet in many ways is even better at disinformation than it is at helping activists promote their causes. And I suspect we'd find I think we'd find similar in the metaverse, that activists would have some advantages in being able to promote their views, but I think it'd be even more outweighed. I think the metaverse is designed for disinformation operations. If I were trying to do disinformation operations, and I've done information operations, I never did disinformation operations, I did information operations, because I was a good guy. But if I was wanting to carry out disinformation operations, the metaverse just sounds perfect. I can mess around with avatars, I can use deep fake technology, I can use GANs, and then put the whole thing on hyperspeed through the metaverse using algorithms to make sure it gets people who are going to believe it. Oh, it'd be so much fun for disinformation. So I think it will help activists, but it will help disinformation even more, and I think that will undermine the impact.
And the next question we have is, as a disclaimer, I'm very biased toward the UK government digital services, because I have at least two close friends who are working from them even now. So that's the GDS. But this question puts into a different light and also ties to the so-called good guys who share information, not disinformation. And this is what the mission of GovUK project and the GDS itself is, to spread the word. I'm saying those who didn't ask this question and probably not familiar with what the government digital services does in the UK. So recently, the UK government experimented with using Discord to communicate with citizens. How many of you have used Discord previously? Okay, so Discord is very popular here. That's amazing. Probably even more popular than at an IT conference. That's something. And the problem is the experiment didn't go as expected. People weren't really having a good user experience communicating with the government through a Discord bot or through Discord. So what do you think? Do you see this type of communication as a possible future between government and citizens?
I think we've not understood all the problems are communicating. So the first thing the problem we've got is that citizens don't believe their governments. And you're not going to get around that by digitalising it. The second thing is, if you digitalise these communications, people expect it to become a conversation. Because when we're online, we expect people to answer us, we expect people to comment on what we say, and governments don't necessarily have the resources to do that. So governments going online, and I've seen this with embassies. Embassies have gone online, they've put out a really nice presentation online, and people started asking questions about it or debating it, and they don't reply because they don't have the resources to do it. So you end up disappointing people. And so that the other thing I think you need to be careful about, and this is not so much what the British government has been doing, but the European External Action Service has set up this operation to tackle Russian disinformation. And it's a disaster. And it's a disaster because they're reacting. So the Russians will say something and they'll say, this is not true. Well, the second you get into that game, you've lost the game. Because at best, you're at their level. At worst, you look mean-spirited, reactive. You undermine your credibility because everyone says, oh, well, of course they're going to say that. I mean, what would they say? And I think they also got caught. You have to be quite careful doing this, getting caught in saying things which are not exactly true either. Or criticising things as disinformation that are points of opinion or points of view. And it's quite difficult doing that. NATO actually are really good at it, to my surprise. NATO try to get out ahead of the story. So they spend a lot of time trying to analyse where they're going to be vulnerable to disinformation. And before the disinformation arrives, they get out a good news story about it. Which means it means that the people doing disinformation are now having to react. And they're looking negative, reactive. And there was one on environmental damage. NATO was very worried. They knew they got criticised for what the damage they did to the environment every time they did a NATO exercise. And it's nice and visual. If you know, tanks ripping up farmland, smoke coming out their chimneys and so on. And so they started, they did a whole thing, they ignored all of that, and did a whole thing about how NATO was contributing to the environment. And NATO doing really positive stuff in the environment. And they discovered this anti-NATO campaign on the environment stopped. Because NATO had now got the narrative, a really positive narrative. So I think that's a really important element of when governments worry about disinformation. But I think government communication through digital means is very, very difficult, and governments don't understand the resources you've got to put into it because people expect you to answer. And if you don't, it's almost worse than not doing it.
That's true. And just I need to ask this question as well, because it's now a popular topic in Romania about security and cybersecurity, especially when I'm not sure if you have heard, probably it's not newsworthy at international level, but locally it was more of a hilarious thing, that there was sort of a summit about cybersecurity defense in Romania, and it got hacked. And on the walls, such as this one, on the presentation, the faces of the participants, there were some people joining with Zoom, were replaced with porn pictures. So probably you have seen that in the news. So now everyone is really cybersecurity aware in Romania for a few weeks, until some people will still fall to old tricks like sheiks spreading money and people sending OLX link on message, which are not really to OLX, and things like that, which are quite common, unfortunately. But back to our topic. Don't you think that involving diplomacy into this futuristic metaverse threatens its security?
First of all, on the cybersecurity, I went to a cybersecurity conference with US military officers, and we deliberately put a flash stick in their folders, and they all got their laptops, and what they do is, first thing they do is they all put the flash sticks. And when they open the flash stick, we'd only put one document on there, which was a slide saying, we have hacked your laptop. They're all looking at it. No, not really, but people do stupid things. And these are supposed to be experts on cybersecurity. Humans do stupid things online. I don't see how diplomacy would threaten cybersecurity, and that it's going to be threatened anyway, and it won't be because diplomats are there. Having diplomats there possibly increases cybersecurity because it gives you another way of managing problems. It's really like in the real world. We don't leave international security to soldiers. Because if we leave international security entirely to soldiers, we know what they're going to do. Because if the only thing you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if you're an army officer, if you're military, you're going to look for military solutions to problems. So we like to have diplomats hanging around in international security issues as well, because they tend to try and find ways of managing international conflict that doesn't result in warfare. So I think that would be true. You're going to get the conflict in metaverse anyway, whether you like it or not. Just as we got it in cyberspace, whether we liked it or not. So having the diplomats there is better than not having them there. And I think one of the big problems we've had in cyberspace is the diplomats arrived really late in the game. There was this kind of feeling that cyberspace is techie, all the problems are techie, therefore we can leave it to techies. And in fact, most of the problems, the hard problems in cyberspace are not technological problems. Technological problems, I can pass to you and you'll deal with them for me. The policy problems are the really hard ones. So I think you're going to have the diplomats there whether you like it or not. I don't think that they in themselves are going to introduce cybersecurity problems in the metaverse. Human nature will do that. And the diplomats are there to help manage the human nature. At the end of the First World War, Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, famously said, "War is too serious to leave to soldiers." I'm inclined to say that the metaverse and cyberspace are too serious to leave to technicians.
And because we are nearing the end of today, and at least this talk, not the day, fortunately, it's just getting dark earlier. I have a really more of a philosophical question here from someone in the audience. But it's quite a common one, so I think it's at least thought-provoking. So maybe we could close this session with this one. How can we be sure that we are not living already in a metaverse?
This is Nick Bostrom's theory at Oxford that we live in a simulation, and that we would have no way of knowing whether we live in a simulation. Two answers. First answer is I think in many ways we are. In that if you think about the time that we all spend online, the extent to which we message. I spent 20 minutes the other day sending WhatsApp messages to my wife about when and where we were going to meet for dinner, before suddenly realising, wait, just ring her and talk to her. And I can do it in 20 seconds on the phone instead of that time. No, I can't do that. What about that time? We are already online so much of our time. And I think obviously one of the companies that's got the biggest advantage in setting up the metaverse is Tencent. Because they've got all of the technology there and all the activities. And there is a sense in which people in China are already living in the metaverse. To the extent to which all their gaming is controlled, their money is already digital. In Beijing, if you want to take a taxi in Beijing as a foreigner, you want to pay in cash, you have to give advance warning to make sure that they can give you change, because everything's done on your phone. Everything's done with WeChat Pay or Alipay. Even the beggars. The beggars have their little QR cards. And so it's amazing. The beggar will show you a QR card, and you scan it, and you give him the equivalent, 10 euro or 30 ROM or whatever, or yuan. And he can then take his little QR card to the shop and buy food or alcohol. I don't know if probably found a way you can buy drugs as well. But, they really have digitalized that. So, in a sense, you can say, there is already for many people a metaverse. And as you find gaming's become interoperable, so you can take your avatar from one game to another game, you can go to Nike and you're buying clothes online. People who are already buying NFTs, I've got no idea why people buy NFTs for enormous sums of money, but they do. So we're creating artificial markets online. I think in many ways, people increasing use of cryptocurrencies, we're almost there. So that's the serious answer. The second answer is there's a blue pill, there's a red pill, they're available at the back of the room, take them on the way out.
I would thank you so much for this talk. It was amazing.
Perfect.
And I would also thank the organizers for providing the venue and organizing this great event. So thank you so much, and have a great evening, everyone. Thanks for attending.
And thank you, Peter. I think I nearly answered all your questions.
Oh, you did more than that, actually. So you're you're more tech savvy than most techies in Romania, especially those closer to government. So that was amazing.
That's a pleasure.